Well, it is a great pleasure and privilege and joy to have you all here today and to welcome Alastair Mcgrath from his home in London. I think you're in London, aren't you, Alastair?
Just outside Oxford.
Just outside Oxford. Okay, well, to welcome Alastair from just outside Oxford. I'm Chris Mulheron. I'm the Executive Director of ISCAST. And for those of you who are not familiar with ISCAST, we're an Australian not-for-profit committed to both mainstream science and Orthodox Christian faith. Many of our senior members, some of whom are here today, are university academics around the country, scientists, philosophers, theologians. We believe that in an increasingly global and secular scientific culture, the science-faith conversation is at the cutting edge of Christian engagement. And so ISCAST engages Australians in this conversation, calling people to take the message of Jesus seriously. We promote that conversation from the level of engaging presentations in schools and churches to the level of academic papers and conferences. How are we funded? Well, I'm glad you asked. We're solely funded by donations and members' subscriptions. So let me encourage you to consider supporting the cause. At the end of tonight's presentation, I'd be happy to tell you more about the exciting things that ISCAST is doing and the plans that we have for the year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years to come. But now I'd like to hand over to Roger Lewis. Roger is chair of ISCAST, as well as a professor of physics in Wollongong. So Roger, over to you.
Thanks for that, Chris. So greetings to you wherever you may be around the world. As mentioned, my name's Roger Lewis and I'm in Wollongong, Australia. And as Chris has mentioned, I'm a physicist. So I hold the role of Senior Professor of Physics at the University of Wollongong and the Associate Dean of Research in the Faculty of Engineering and Information Sciences. So I'm also a Christian. I belong to a local church here in Fig Tree Anglican Church in Wollongong. So I just mentioned I'm personally very grateful for the existence of ISCAST because it brings together those two areas of my life, my physics and my faith. So you might say my profession of physics and my profession of Christ. And this is what the heart of ISCAST is, science, Christianity in conversation. So we're here today to think about, remember, one of the key voices in that dialogue between science and Christianity, John Polkinghorne, a physicist who became a priest. Different people are going to give their perspectives, and I'm very much looking forward to it. But let me just give you a brief context, a brief overview of some of the key events in John Polkinghorne's life. So he was born on 16th of October 1930. He graduated with a PhD in 1955. He became Professor of Mathematical Physics at Cambridge in 1968 and stayed there till 1979 when he resigned to study for the Anglican priesthood. And along the way, he became a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1974. He was ordained as a deacon in the Anglican Church in 1981, then as a priest in 1982. He was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1997. And then for his contributions to research at the interface of science and religion, he received the Templeton Prize in 2002. And that was from the hand of His Royal Highness, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who as I think we all know passed away on the 9th of April. And John Polkinghorne, in fact, passed away a month before on the 9th of March 2021. Let me just give one quotation from Polkinghorne, and this is from the book, The Way the World Is. And I chose this because of these deaths and the thing we remember at this time of year, the one who rose from the dead. So this is what the quotation: "If death was not the final word for Jesus, it is also the Christian conviction that it is not the final word for us either. As in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive." 1 Corinthians 15:22. It is part of the grand picture of salvation that his destiny is to be ours also. So without further ado, let me just on behalf of the ISCAST board thank the Executive Director, Chris Mulheron, and our Program Director, Sarah Wilson, for arranging this event, and welcome you all to what I expect will be a time of recollection, reflection, engagement, and encouragement. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Well, it's my pleasure to welcome Alastair Mcgrath with us. John Polkinghorne was a giant of the science and Christianity, science and religion conversation. And it's our pleasure to have another giant with us today. Alastair, how many books have you written that bring around the science and faith issue?
Probably too many.
Well, I'm guessing 30?
It might be, but it's quite a lot because I find it really interesting.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have you with us tonight. Alastair, could you tell us very briefly what your role at Oxford University is? And then please lead off into your tribute to John Polkinghorne.
Yes, well, I'm the Andreas Idreos Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford. The chair was founded in the 1990s. I'm the third occupant, and you may know that the person who preceded me was Peter Harrison, who's now, of course, at Queensland. So it's one of the very few chairs in a global research university on the specific topic of science and religion, and it generates a lot of interest from students, I have to say. We get a lot of people coming to our lectures. So let me then begin to reflect on John Polkinghorne. And I may say things that others will say as well, but I think it's very important just to begin by setting context. And of course, the key point, I think, is to begin by making the point that Polkinghorne was a very reflective Christian. And we find this, I think, even as an undergraduate at Cambridge, where of course he was studying mathematics at Trinity College, Cambridge, but he was also involved in the work of the Cambridge Intercollegiate Christian Union, which is an evangelical group. And that's where he met his wife, Ruth, of course, who was also a mathematician. I think I want to say that even in his later writings, I see very much the afterglow of that Cambridge student Christian period. You know, Polkinghorne's clearly someone who was a very able scientist, but also thought Christianity was important and clearly wanted others to appreciate the importance of this. So he's a very significant figure, and I sense there's not simply an academic dimension to his reflections on science and faith. I think there's also a quest for personal integration. I think that's one of the reasons why I find him such a compelling writer, because he clearly has thought this thing through and is trying to express himself in words that he himself found credible and hoped others would find as well. And as you all know, he went and did some work in the States, then went back to Cambridge via Scotland, and eventually became professor of mathematical physics there. But I guess we're jumping now to 1979, and two things happened in 1979. One's very important, one's not quite so important. The very important thing is that Polkinghorne announced he was giving up his Cambridge professorship in order to study for ministry in the Church of England. And he clearly saw this as being the right thing for him to do. He felt he had done all that he could do in his professional field. He now wanted to develop some sort of ministerial career. So that was a hugely important thing. He went to train a place in Westcott House, in Cambridge, called Westcott House. The second thing, which is not quite so interesting, but nevertheless, it might be interesting in its own little way, is that that's where I trained for ministry for the Church of England, and he and I overlapped for a year, 1979 to 1980. And both of us felt that at that stage, I was a scientist myself. I had then done theology, and I wanted to find some way of integrating these, but not just integrating them academically, but being able to engage a wider public, and felt that the public ministry of the church was a very good way of doing this. And actually, Polkinghorne, I think, felt something very similar. In the end, we took slightly different directions, but the point is that actually there was a synergy of sorts there. And I personally felt that Polkinghorne, kind of way, might not be doing the right thing. I'll tell you why. I was shown to be wrong, but I mean, the thought I had was, this man is going to go into the Church of England. He's going to end up running a parish. Running a parish is hugely time-consuming. How is he going to get any thinking done? How is he going to get any writing done? I wondered if this might be a misstep, but actually I was shown to be wrong. because basically Polkinghorne was ordained. He went to serve in some parishes, one in Bristol in the west of England, and quite a working class area, I have to say. And then he went on to serve as incumbent at a village in Kent, quite close to Canterbury. But I think that provided him with the interface he needed to begin to think how he would express the ideas he was developing in terms that ordinary people can understand. And as any of you who are in the ordained ministry will know, one of the lessons you learn early and you learn it the hard way is you've got to learn the language of your audience. You've got to be able to speak in terms they will understand. And when I first began to read Polkinghorne, the first book of his I read was The Way the World Is. I have to say, this was published in 1984, that this struck me as being, remarkably lucid, intelligent, and intelligible. In other words, you could understand this guy. The sentences were beautifully constructed. The ideas were clear. He was clearly able to speak to ordinary Christians intelligently and passively about his own faith, and also how this connected up with his work in science. So I first began to read him actually when I was back at Oxford, this time teaching theology. I thought, this man has found his métier. This is him. This is going to be good. I wonder what will come next. And of course, as we all know, a lot came next, but it really maintained this very distinctive approach. And I would single out this sentence from one of his early books. I think just basically is a kind of neat little summary of what he says. Science, theology and science differ greatly in the nature of something they're concerned, yet each is attempting to understand aspects of the way the world is. In other words, the science, there's Christianity, they are not the same, but they have important things to say, and they can, in effect, say them better when they talk to each other and try and connect up their conversations. And I think that Polkinghorne is a very significant writer because many in the field of science and religion, I think, for example, of Arthur Peacock, developed an approach to Christianity, which I personally found quite difficult to relate to. It seemed to be a somewhat emaciated and impoverished vision of Christianity. Maybe that's just me being critical, I don't know. But but Polkinghorne, when you read him, I mean, this was Christianity. It was incarnational, it was Trinitarian, and he was able to make these connections between his faith and his theology and his science. And I thought that was really, really good. I did wonder, though, how long he would stay in the parish, because it couldn't give him enough time to do the serious thinking, which he clearly was so able to do. And then, of course, he was called back to Cambridge, and first of all to be Dean of Chapel of Trinity Hall, and then, to everyone's surprise, and in fact, he once told me, including his own, he actually was invited to be president of Queen's College, Cambridge. Now, I need to say to you that in the British academic world, that is right up there. That is very, very significant. And to be head of house, as they say, is just an astonishing honor. And it really shows the very high esteem in which he was held. So basically, what we're talking about is somebody who is not simply a very good exponent of relation science and faith, but somebody who kind of had become a pillar of the Cambridge academic establishment in his new role. I think that is really important because, particularly if you aren't based in the UK, sometimes you don't pick up on this. Actually, if you like, Polkinghorne was able to speak from a position of real authority on the relation of science and faith. And that, I think, did help a lot. It wasn't just he was clear, that was wonderful. It wasn't just he was orthodox, that was wonderful as well. It was actually he was speaking from a position of power and authority, and that really helped things along. So there are lots of people, I'd be one of them, who would say Polkinghorne is one of the most important writers in this field in the last 50 years. What stands out? Well, actually, there's quite a lot. I mean, if you had to ask me, what do you think are the most important things about Polkinghorne, I would begin with the fluidity, the transparency, the elegance of his language. He writes very, very clearly. And for those of us who are theologians, I think we learn very quickly this is not a widely shared virtue, if I can put it like that. And Polkinghorne, I think, is very, very good at expressing himself. But what I think I found really helpful is that Polkinghorne described himself as being a bottom-up thinker. And what I think he meant by that is he's not really superimposing a kind of metaphysical framework on science. He's more trying to say, look, let's look at what science is saying and then see how we can make connections with what theologians are saying. And I actually think that is quite helpful. I mean, I think he's very, very good, for example, in pointing out that the intelligibility of our universe is really important theologically. And I think that Polkinghorne is very, very helpful in thinking about this really interesting question, which Eugene Wigner talks about quite a lot, which is why on earth does mathematics track the structures of the universe so successfully? It is a very puzzling feature, and Polkinghorne had quite a lot to say about that, as he did, of course, about the anthropic fine-tuning of the universe, which is always being connected with this. And again, he saw this as being explained, perhaps that's too strong a word, as being consilient with and the Christian understanding of creation. And that, I think, is very, very important. From my own professional perspective, one of the things I valued about Polkinghorne was his engagement with natural theology. I think he and I are pretty much on the same page about this. Neither of us thinks that natural theology is about proving God's existence from the observance of nature, but we are in the business of saying that there's a resonance or a consonance or a congruity between the Christian way of looking at the natural world and a scientific way of looking at it. But if you like, the theological vision brings depth to the scientific vision. And Polkinghorne, of course, does talk quite a lot about stereoscopic vision. You have this lens, you have that lens, use them together, you see deeper. And that, to me, is a really very important theme indeed. So as I kind of reflect on John Polkinghorne, I would say that this man has done so much. I've read his Terry lectures. They are very, very good. That was quite a signal honor. And of course, he gave them just shortly after he retired from Cambridge. He has a Templeton Prize. All the big landmarks in the field are things he has done. And what I think I want to say is that he is an excellent ambassador for the field of science and religion. He shows it is intellectually sensible. He shows it is pastorally applicable. He's shown you can preach this kind of stuff. But I think in other ways, what he does is, if you like, to stand back a bit and allow others to come in and develop these ideas further. I've heard people criticize Polkinghorne for not being sufficiently theological. I'm not sure about that. I mean, what I see as Polkinghorne working with a kind of consensual theological framework, but leaving it to others to kind of take things further. He's gone as far as he wants to, I think, and is now kind of giving other people a base on which they can build. So my personal view is that Polkinghorne is an ambassador for the field. He's shown it makes sense academically. It's not an intruder in the academy. It belongs there. He's also given us a body of literature to which I quite happily go back again and again, which is intelligible, which is applicable. And actually, finally, I mean, I'm sure others will speak more about this. He was a really nice guy. I mean, I just need to say that actually he did not have that kind of arrogance that you sometimes find with academics who've reached a really high point in their career. He actually was very approachable, very humble, very self-deprecating. And I think that to me was a very special thing. So it's right to remember, John, I've just started your conversation and I know there's a lot more that's going to be said, and that's going to be great.
Thank you so much, Alastair. I wonder if you wouldn't mind giving thanks to God for John's life.
I'd be very happy to do that. Let's just say a word of prayer together.
Thank you.
Father, we thank you for raising up people who can inspire us and help us to think and give us encouragement. And we remember now John. We thank you for him. We thank you for his partnership with Ruth. We thank you for the faith they shared together and also the wisdom he expressed in developing his own approach to science and faith. And we pray, Lord, that it will continue to be a resource to many others as they think these questions through. We thank you for him. We thank you for the many others who encourage us and inspire us, and also for the hope that he reflected in his life, which we can share as well. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you again, Alastair. Now, I know that you need to leave us before our meeting ends tonight, but I wonder if you might take a few questions or comments. Let's just
I'd love to.
take a few minutes to reflect on what you've said. People might like to ask you a question. If you would like to ask a question, please unmute yourself and speak up. Now is not the time for lengthy comments, but a brief question or a brief comment would be fine. There being no takers, we have a number of other speakers tonight. 3 are recorded and another 2 are live with us tonight. But I'll just give you one more chance if you'd like to ask Alastair a question or make a brief comment on anything that he's said. Excellent. Okay. Well, I'm now going to move on to 2 recordings. One from Mick Pope. Mick Pope is a scientist and theologian here in Melbourne. It was actually Mick's suggestion that we do something to offer a tribute to John Polkinghorne. And we set up tonight's meeting, and then Mick discovered that he had something else on that he really couldn't get out of. So I'm going to share now a short video of a conversation I had with Mick not too long ago. Now let me see if I can find the right one. It's this one. If something goes wrong with the video, please I'm sure somebody will let me know that you can't see it or you can't hear it. G'day Mick, good to see you. Why don't you briefly introduce yourself before I ask you to get into your thoughts about John Polkinghorne?
All right, so this whole idea, this whole evening is my idea, and now I can't be there, so apologies to everyone. Would love to have been there. So my name is Mick Pope. I have a PhD in meteorology. I've been a meteorologist for over 2 decades now. I started in astrophysics, theoretical physics, which is kind of where I partly crossed paths with John, as we'll talk about. And I'm currently studying a master's in theology at Whitley College. I'm particularly interested in things like the Anthropocene, which is the larger framing narrative behind climate change and the way in which God interacts with the creation and our human responsibility and all of that.
Great. Well, thank you for being here. Why don't you tell us briefly about John Polkinghorne's impact on you personally and also as a scientist theologian?
Sure. I first met John. I first heard him speak when he was in Sydney, and this would have been the early 90s. I think it was organised by ISCAST, which was my first interaction with ISCAST too. So that's how I got caught, taken up in that organisation. And he also preached at St Barnabas Broadway, which is where I was at. And I guess there's 2 aspects for me. The first is anyone who ever met John is that he came across as an incredibly intelligent, wise, but very godly man. So his character spoke volumes, I think. Very gentle, very winsome. It's the sort of person you could listen to for hours on end, the things that he spoke about. So there was that aspect of things. But also I think that up until then, I hadn't really been exposed to people who'd reflected deeply upon their science from a theological perspective. You know, you get the kind of relatively shallow, if you'll forgive me, reflections on, say, what's the concordance view of Genesis 1? So how does that match up to science, and all those kind of really simplistic arguments that don't hold a lot of water. So he was a man who had multiple PhDs in science and in theology, and he'd reflected very deeply. And he was thinking about things like, how does God interact with the creation in a way that's sensible? So not a non-interventionalist God, but how does, his famous phrase is epistemology models ontology. So he looks in quantum mechanics as a way in which God can input information into the universe and have influence things from a top-down kind of manner. He also rather controversially thinks that chaos theory, that kind of non-linear chaotic behavior in dynamical systems, is a real feature of reality and not just a matter of our ignorance, and God interacts in that way. And that was intellectually intriguing. But also, as I continued to read over the years, his understanding of kenosis, the idea that creation is that, well, to go back a step, people would be familiar with the hymn in Philippians 2 about Christ self-emptying on the cross. And that, of course, is a deep and profound statement about the very nature and being of God as being a self-emptying God, a loving God, a sacrificial God. And John wants to extend that to creation, which is a really intriguing thought, that somehow the very act of creation itself is God setting aside or making room for the other to be, and that's somehow a self-emptying and risky type process. It gives us freedom, it gives us agency. It introduced risk, but it doesn't limit God. It's like a self-limiting kind of thing. And so,
and can I just interrupt there?
Sure.
When you say making room for the other to be, but you're not just talking about human beings and human agency, are you?
No, not at all. So John talks about free will, and I know that's a huge sticking point in theology for some and what that means. And he doesn't, anywhere that I read, mean that in a Pelagian sense, that we can pull ourselves up by our moral bootstraps and save ourselves. He's very firm on the incarnation. He's very firm on the cross. He's also very firm on eschatology. That is end times, the summing together. I think he's familiar with Tom Wright. Tom would say putting everything to rights. So that's very a firm plank in John's kind of thinking. But he also talks about free process. And this is a wonderful way around where a lot of Christians trip up with the early chapters of Genesis, which I've spent the past 3 years almost fed up with it for the moment. I was just working on my thesis, but the need to force that into a neat mechanistic box, which is to say, God said, therefore it was, and that's precisely how it happened. Never mind the issues of Hebrew forms and the kind of literature that it is. But John wants to say that God endows the universe with free process, that it partakes in its own unfolding, its own becoming. And so there's inherent freedom in that. There's also inherent risk. It's a way, in a sense of, it's a form of theodicy, a form of the problem of a good God and a universe where evil exists and suffering occurs, that there's freedom for that to occur. There's the risk that will happen, but it's not God's ultimate purpose. And it's like, to use a phrase I know John would never use, God doesn't get his hands dirty in causing evil per se, but very much gets his hands dirty in the incarnation of rescuing human beings from the consequences of that and our poor moral choices, and ultimately bringing the entire universe to its fruition.
So you've talked about Polkinghorne's the freedom, if you like, that he sees God giving the universe to develop, but you've also talked about excuse me, his eschatology, that God will put it to rights in the end. Is there a risk there in that freedom that it won't go the universe? How does God's sovereignty work with? Sure, it's the classic problem of freedom and determinism, sovereignty and free will, but how does Polkinghorne draw those two things together? That's
a really good question. How long do we have? And I don't know.
A few more minutes.
Yeah, I don't know that anyone has a perfect. Well, nobody has a perfect answer to that. Let's face it. But he does talk about, I think, through his epistemology, models ontology, through his idea that creation is open. Can we just
interrupt there?
Yeah.
Epistemology, study of knowledge, models ontology, how things are.
Correct.
And itself.
Yeah, to tease that out a little bit, John, like a lot of scientists who reflect upon their practice, is a critical realist, which is simply to say that John acknowledges that there is an objective other, and indeed in the theological sense a subjective other, that really does exist independent of human senses, and that we can experience something of that through our senses, and that our senses are theory laden. So the way we think the world works affects how we see the world, but there's this constant interaction if you're willing to be humble about it, and where you constantly modify your theories about the way in which the world works. And that works both in science, which is provisional knowledge, but also in theology. And I find that really intriguing. That riffs off something I read recently out of Alastair McGrath, one of his books, where he's almost talking about we need to think about theological theories and be humble in our knowledge and our understanding of things like atonement and ultimately eschatology and the very things we're talking about. But to bring it back to Polkinghorne, then I guess you would say that this whole idea that our epistemology models ontology, that our theories somehow model reality, and that we can say from those theories that we have about, say, quantum mechanics and chaos, that there's an openness of the creation to divine action, but there's a way in which God can lead that creation forward to God's own ends without necessarily forcing everything. That there's people often draw the analogy between an orchestra and jazz improvisation, which is to say that I'm no jazz musician, I'm a very poor guitarist if it comes to that, that you're not just following a strict score per se, where every note is written down, but there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a tune, there's a theme that keeps coming back. And that, I think, for John really is that kenotic theme of divine love that filters down through the process of evolution through altruism, that reaches its pinnacle as acme in the cross, but was there in the very beginning in creation itself, which is imbued with not just freedom to explore the evolutionary phase space, to explore moral dimensions, but that it's also inherent in that is a telos, an end to which it's moving forward to, and God will summon that up at the eschaton.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us, Mick. I think that you're going to enjoy. What was it? It was what sort of a band are you seeing on Saturday night when we're having a meeting? It's a heavy metal jazz
band.
Or a folk
Yeah, not
band.
quite jazz, but heavy metal and folk music.
Okay, well, enjoy your folk metal, and we'll meet on Saturday night. Thanks for joining us in this recording anyway. Bye now.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it from Mick Pope. Now I'm going to go straight to another conversation that I had with Alan Gijsbers. Alan is the immediate past chair of ISCAST, and as you'll see, he has read and thought a fair bit about John Polkinghorne. So to Alan. Hello, Alan. It's good to see you.
Yes, likewise, Chris. Yeah.
Tell us briefly who you are.
All right. Well, I'm an addiction physician, so I trained in general medicine and then went into a specialist physician and then moved into addiction physician. One of my first loves from high school days was an interest in physics, and I won a prize in my first year at university, the T.F. Ryan Röntgen Prize. So physics has always been one of my loves, and to have physicists over the years discussing not only physics but metaphysics has been one of my delights. I therefore enjoy ISCAST an awful lot because we're often scientists who are trying to find sort of the basic fundamentals of things and then moving into the larger areas of the bigger questions. So in that respect, meeting John Polkinghorne was extremely exciting, because here you have a professor of mathematical physics from Cambridge who knows about quarks, gluons, and all of those sort of things in great detail, and who then decides to do theology because he also wants to understand the world from a theological perspective. To have.
So how did you come across Polkinghorne?
Oh, well, he came out to Australia as a visiting lecturer. I forget quite who sponsored those things, but I think ISCAST had a role in that. And on the last occasion when he came out to Australia, I was privileged enough to chair the ISCAST meeting that we had at St Jude's, Carlton, before it was renovated. And we filled the church with people who were interested in a physicist talking about aspects of Christian theology and physics.
So tell us what aspects of John Polkinghorne's thinking particularly caught your interest?
Oh, well, there are so many. It's sort of hard to start, but I think probably the best place to start is the question of reality. And of course, that's been a question that we in ISCAST have been grappling with. And Alastair Mcgrath, when he came out to our conference on science and Christianity, also spoke on what is reality. Reality is a big issue. I've published on it in relation to reality and addiction, because people who take addictive agents are said to alter their perception of reality into seeing reality more truly. I evaluate that. But John Polkinghorne discusses the nature of reality very well in a number of his books, including one of his latest, which is Exploring Reality Here, which I'm going through at present in more detail. So what is reality and how do we encounter it? He embraces the idea of what's called critical realism, which is that the theories that we develop about what reality is are not just inventions. They're actually based in what is actually there. We are discovering things which are there, but that they are models of what we abstract, a reflection of that reality and not reality itself.
And you're an addiction physician. You deal with human beings. What about what John Polkinghorne had to contribute to human nature, that sort of thing? I think you've got something to say there.
Oh, well, there's a lot to say about a lot of things, but one of the things that I found very helpful recently, not necessarily from John Polkinghorne's writings, but that physicists and scientists, they're really looking at the nature of the world, the fabric of the universe, if you like. But the fabric of the universe is the stage upon which another story is told, which is the story of human beings. And it's a story of human beings, that is the sort of the drama of who we are and what stories we create. That's an extra dimension. And of course, as an addiction physician, I'm interested in people's stories because their stories start to describe who they are and where they're going. One of the great problems back in the 70s, before we sort of thought more about things, is if the world is as determined as we think it is, that is, everything's like clockwork, how then can we have free will? How can we show initiative and of those sort of things? And I think it's been very helpful through both John Polkinghorne's work and then later George Ellis as well, to recognize that science is not just looking at predictable models, but science sees itself in terms of hierarchies from the very lowest level of subatomic particles to then atoms, to then molecules, to then macromolecules, from macromolecules in the medical sciences into cells and then neurons and neural activities. And at each of these layers, new phenomena emerge which are not predictable from phenomena below. And this business of, if you like, an anti-reductionistic approach, seeing the world as being hierarchical, where properties at the higher level emerge which were not predictable from the lower level, that I think is a very important idea. And then in the end, what you have is human beings who emerge, who are capable of rational thought, who are capable of expressing emotions, who are capable of developing meaning, understanding themselves, and who then enter into dramas in terms of relationships. And that becomes very important. Now, the interesting thing is that if we believe that there is top-down causation, that is, that a thought can create an action, and I can show you that by suggesting that maybe you might like to scratch your head right now, whereupon if you do, then you'll have shown that my thought of you scratching your head is changed into your actual action of scratching a head. And that in the same way, Polkinghorne suggests that God, who is the divine thought, can act into this physical world somehow. I think I prefer that sort of top-down approach, even though I don't understand it, I cannot explain its mechanism. I prefer that to the other idea that he has, which is that God acts at the level of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and fuzzy logic and chaos theory and those sort of things. I think God just doesn't act right at the very, very low levels, but he acts at a much more holistic level.
Polkinghorne also has ideas about God acting, but also stepping back and allowing the universe freedom, doesn't he?
Well, I think, look, that's been a great discussion, and I've really enjoyed being part of that, not just through Polkinghorne, but Polkinghorne and George Ellis, George Ellis was the next president of the International Society of Christian Scientists. He took over from John Polkinghorne. But both of them had the idea, which I think is a very lovely one, of what he called kenosis, Kenosis is stepping back to create space to let the other be the other. If I may tell a personal story, when I asked George Ellis to speak on the hierarchy on emergent complexity at the Royal Melbourne Hospital in a grand round, we had a physicist talking to physicians, which was rather interesting. His wife, who had dementia, came with him. And I asked my addiction nurse, Patricia, to look after Mary. And Patricia had just read about George Ellis's kenotic ideas, which have been shared with John Polkinghorne. And she then created space to let Mary be Mary. And she wrote up that subsequently as a reflection in her training as a psychodrama teacher, and the significance of that. And I think creating space to let the other be the other is a very important concept in interpersonal relationships. And I think that kenotic idea which John Polkinghorne developed in relation to, say, evolution, where God somehow created space for the world to be free to develop itself in whatever direction it would, I think is a very exciting one.
Mm.
I think it's also worth marrying this, and I mean, we're talking about all the greats that have visited ISCAST in the last 20 years or so, that Simon Conway Morris comes along and says, look, evolution isn't entirely random at all. There seem to be sort of highways of evolutionary pathways, so that certain ways of developing seem to be inbuilt into the system. It's not totally random at all. So that, for instance, he says that in evolution, there have been sort of 6 examples of the camera eye being developed, you know, the idea of a lens and a retina. And that's been evolved on 6 separate occasions, but on each occasion, a similar product has emerged. So there seems to be some sort of evolutionary constraints as to what develops and what doesn't. But nevertheless, in spite of that the world is given the freedom to be itself, I think is a very interesting one.
Mm-hmm. Let me finish by asking you, what about a personal comment? How does John Polkinghorne and people like John Polkinghorne, somebody who was, you know, a scientist for the first 45 years of his life, and then he turns to become an Anglican minister of all things, speaking as an Anglican minister, how do these people encourage you?
Look, I think personally, I was enormously struck by, first of all, his humility. I mean, to be able to invite him to pray before that presentation at St. Jude's, that was just terrific, to pray together like that. So I think his godliness and his humility was something was very impressive, as was the fact that the way in which he handled the questions when they were asked. He was respectful in listening to what the person had to say. And I think John Pilbrow makes a similar comment, that he tries to enhance the quality of the question that was being asked. Mm. So in that sense, I think that's very encouraging. It's also very encouraging to see a person of obviously of a very large brain being able to grapple with all the issues of being a Christian and to make some sort of sense of it. Because in the end, he doesn't sort of give thousands of knockdown reasons as to why Christianity is right and you're wrong. But he says, look, this is the best plausible explanation of all the different realities in the world that we have to cope with. And I think central to that is his idea of, well, what do you think of Jesus Christ? What sort of a person is he? And of course, today, Easter Monday, we're reflecting again on the incredible story of the conquest of death by Jesus. Now, that I think is one can be profoundly scientific and yet accept the resurrection of Jesus, because as a once-off event, what you've got to establish is, first of all, is there good evidence for that event to occur? And our explanations as to how that may have occurred come secondary, rather than around the other way. Because it doesn't fit in with our scientific theories, therefore it can't have happened. That's a non-scientific way of approaching the resurrection. The scientific way is to first of all establish what the facts are. And when we've established the facts, we've got to fit our theories around those facts.
Well, thank you, Alan, for joining us at a distance of 5 days, because we recorded this on Easter Monday. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you have a good holiday, and for that reason you won't be with us on Saturday.
That's right, it's my birthday and we're going away for that weekend. So
well, happy birthday, have a lovely weekend.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks for this.
Bye
thanks
now.
Bye. Chris, before we go, I just want to talk about some of John Polkinghorne's books because I think they've been extremely valuable.
Sure.
I haven't read all 26 of the books on relation between science and religion. That's just too much. But one of the first books I read was the book, The Way the World Is, which I think is a very helpful book if people are scientists and want to know what Christianity is all about. It's an introduction to the relationship between science and religion. And I think it's almost like a C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, but for scientists. A similar one to that, about 10, 15 years later, is Quark's Chaos and Christianity. Again, an introductory book, the sort of thing that you could give to the young students and things like that. There are a lot of other books. I won't go through all of them. The one that I particularly value is Science and Christian Belief, which is a copy of his Gifford Lectures. The Gifford Lectures every year, one of the 4 universities in Scotland asks a prominent scientist or a Christian or a theologian to speak about natural theology. John Polkinghorne chose to expound the Nicene Creed, and I'm rather proud of the signature there and the reference to 1 Thessalonians 5:21, which of course you know is saying, test all things, hold fast to that which is good. And whenever I see silly comments in Facebook or something like that, if I'm moved to respond, I respond by saying 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test all things, hold fast to that which is true.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Alan. Good
Great.
to talk to you.
Okay. Good.
Bye now.
See you. Bye.
Well, I almost cut Alan off early there, didn't I? Alan Gijsbers, immediate past chair of ISCAST. Now, before we hear from John Pilbrow, this time live because he was able to be with us tonight, I wonder if anybody does have a comment, you are welcome to speak. We have a little bit of space between speakers, or we can finish early. But if anybody would like to make a comment, a brief comment, they're welcome to.
Me, it's John White here. And
right, John, why don't you introduce yourself just briefly, because you're an important person in the history of ISCAST.
Well, I think I was connected with some of these people who've been speaking to ISCAST over the last 40 years. And that was a very, very good program. And by the way, it was paid for by the British Council. We managed to get them to pay the fares and the living expenses, and ISCASTians put them up when they came.
You've muted yourself, John. And again, let me see if I can.
I've done it. Is that right?
Yes.
The comment is one that I made to a colleague the other day about the way we do science. And this man came to me quite pleased by the fact that he'd had a theory of what he would observe in an experiment. And he found that it agreed exactly with the calculation that he'd done. And my reply to him, which actually discountenanced him a bit, was, what a pity. Because the truth is that the discovery of new things within science is that sort of thing which lights up the scientist's mind, just as it's true of when one discovers Christian understandings, such as one or two of the things which we were talked about tonight, light up that too.
Great.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Would anyone else like to make a comment? Well, we might go to you, John Pilbrow. John Pilbrow.
Hello.
Also a past president of ISCAST, also a physicist, once head of physics at Monash University, and also somebody who knew John Polkinghorne and would like to offer his thoughts. John, over to you.
Thank you very much. We've heard already that there's much more to John Polkincorn than the person some of us have come to know through his extensive range of books at the faith-science interface. We know that we've already heard tonight that he traded his chair of mathematical physics at Cambridge at age 49 to pursue a new career as an ordained Anglican priest. This sea change was greeted with surprise, even incredulity. And I remember explaining to colleagues here and in the United States at the time that this was a perfectly reasonable thing for a person of faith to do. He certainly enjoyed his career in science and didn't leave science behind because he was disillusioned. He felt he'd done his bit for it after some 25 years of professional work. In the 40 years or so since then, John focused on encouraging and enabling sound conversation and dialogue amongst and between scientists and theologians. He was not spared the normal challenges in life. For example, his wife Ruth died about 20 years ago after a 5-year battle with cancer. Just a couple of particularly personal reminiscences that included my wife Susan. In 1993, we had the great privilege of spending a whole Sunday with John and Ruth, during which John explained that his upcoming Gifford lectures would be a theological reflection on the Nicene Creed in the light of modern science. This resulted in what I consider to be his most important book, Science and Christian Belief, Theological Reflections of a Bottom-Up Thinker, a remarkable attestation of Christian orthodoxy, and I share with Alan Gijsbers an agreement that this is one of his greatest books. And then in April 2007, John hosted us to afternoon tea at his home in Cambridge, having just returned from a conference in Heidelberg. He'd flown into Stansted that morning, caught a bus to Cambridge, and arrived home in time to put the kettle on. Awaiting his return was a parcel from the Yale University Press with copies of his latest book, Quantum Physics and Theology. And I won't let Alan upstage me. There's my signed copy of that particular book. Alastair referred, others have referred tonight to the very first book in the science faith field that John wrote, which was The Way the World Is. I point out that this was written during his curacy in the working class parish in Bristol. How he did that, I have no idea. But his aim was twofold: to explain to his scientific colleagues the basis of his faith as a scientist, and also how a thinking person can be a Christian. John White's already referred, and Alan Gijsbers, to John's visits to Australia, and he came to Melbourne in 1993, 1995, and 1998, during which he presented many lectures on topics at the faith-science interface, and I had the privilege of chairing a good many of those. In 1993, he gave a large lecture to a large audience, jointly sponsored by ISCAST and the Institute for Spiritual Studies. And at Monash, a lunchtime talk on faith and science, and a much appreciated physics lecture entitled 6 Problem Areas in Physics, and he had our students eating out of his hand. And then finally, in 1998, he presented a memorable lunchtime lecture at Monash on the nature of reality to a very large audience of around 200. His lectures were always lucid, presented in a language a generally well-educated audience could comprehend. This was exemplified in the kinds of questions that his lectures generated. Always gracious, John had the great capacity to turn what might appear dumb questions into something significant. He engaged with questioners saying something like this: have you thought of it this way? Or perhaps this raises a deeper issue. Such questioners went away strongly encouraged. But more than that, what I remember most was not just what he said, but how he said it. John certainly believed in the unity of knowledge and one reality, the world of our experience that we seek to describe scientifically. As we've heard tonight, he was a critical realist. No, I won't pursue that. But he had something very interesting to say. It's a sort of long quote, but I think it's worth reading in full. If we're seeking to serve the God of truth, then we should really welcome truth from whatever source it comes. We shouldn't fear the truth. The doctrine of creation of the kind that the Abrahamic faiths profess is such that it encourages the expectation that there will be a deep order in the world, expressive of the mind and purpose of that world's creator. It also asserts that the character of this order has been freely chosen by God, since it was not determined beforehand by some kind of pre-existing blueprint. As a consequence, the nature of cosmic order cannot be discovered just by taking thought, but the pattern of the world has to be discerned through the observations and experiments that are necessary in order to determine what form the divine choice has actually taken. Not only does Polkinghorne acknowledge free will as a significant human trait, as we've heard already tonight, but in extending the argument to the whole universe in the free process defense, he articulated a view of the processes in the universe from the Big Bang until now that have a level of genuine openness. In this context, he also said somewhere, God didn't produce a ready-made world. The Creator has done something cleverer than that, making a world able to make itself. Mick Pope's already referred to epistemology models ontology. I just want to say a little bit about that. This was, I believe, a metaphysical claim. That is, what we know about the world represents the reality it seeks to describe. And just as an aside, he explained to us back in 1993 that his wife Ruth threatened to go to the market in Cambridge and have a T-shirt emblazoned with the words epistemology models ontology, but he didn't think he would wear it even if she'd got it for him. Anyone who wishes to speak of agency, whether human or divine, he says, will have to adopt a metaphysical point of view, and metaphysical views are ontologically serious. They seek to describe what is the case. He recognized that there are, in fact, ontological gaps, a genuine unknowability, resulting, for example, from quantum indeterminacy. He was always careful to remind us that we mustn't confuse epistemological ignorance, that is, gaps in knowledge that might one day be filled or uncovered, with ontological unknowability, those things which we cannot know in principle. He also talked about this in his frequent use of the concept of verisimilitude, which means basically similarity to the truth. And you'll find many quotes in his books. I just give one. He explained that if we thought that certain truth is our necessary goal, we shall have to be content with the more modest aim of verisimilitude. He frequently referred to Dirac's relativistic theory of the electron, which predicted the existence of antimatter long before it was discovered. And he said, when this sort of thing happens, it's very convincing evidence for the verisimilitude of the theory. And just as an aside, these days, positrons or negative electrons underpin positron emission tomography scans used widely in medicine. And one final point, regarding the success of science, he said that it is gaining a tightening grasp of an actual reality. We shall miss a true, gracious, and generous Christian. We're all the better for his example and beneficiaries of his many books and insights that will contribute to help us explore the interaction between Christian faith and modern science for a long time to come. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you. If anybody, once again, I'm going to leave a space for people to make a comment or perhaps to ask John a question. Well, thank you, John. We're now going to hear from two women. We've kept the women till last. One is a recording with Philippa Lohmeyer-Collins. Philippa is a chaplain at Mentone Grammar here in Melbourne. And then we'll turn to Nicola, who I will introduce again in a minute. So firstly, let me see if I can share my screen once more, and let's join the conversation between Nicola and myself. Hello, Philippa, great to see you. Why don't you tell us a bit about who you are briefly, and then I'll ask you about John Polkinghorne.
Okay, well, I'm Philippa Lohmeyer-Collins, so I'm married to Stephen Collins, who's an ISCAST fellow, heavily involved with ISCAST. I'm a chaplain, teacher, so I work at Mentone Girls as their school chaplain. Which is a privilege. I love that job. What else? I'm a member at St Jude's. I don't know what else to say about myself.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So here we are in this tribute to John Polkinghorne.
Yeah.
What is your connection with John Polkinghorne?
My connection is back in the late 1900s, so 1998, Dr. Peter Adam, who was the vicar of St Jude's, invited me to run a series of open forums, thinking Christianly about the world. I think his concern was that we help people integrate their everyday life with the world around, with Christianity, with God. So how does God interact in the world? And part of, I think, the issue behind it was we had at St Jude's, where I was a member, a lot of people who were doing terrific work in the world. So they were being God's person, allowing God's Holy Spirit to work through them. And we actually wanted to tap in to their thinking and tap into how they were being God's person in the world. And Alan Gijsbers, who was involved with ISCAST, suggested, why don't we combine ISCAST annual lecture with St Jude's Open Forum, and he knew John Polkinghorne was coming out, so he said, why don't we invite John Polkinghorne to give a lecture? And I was actually keen because I'd read Science and Creation, one of his books, many years ago, because I'd started off life as a chemist, that is in my professional working life. And the whole idea of integrating my science for myself with God and seeing the interaction between that, because I knew a whole lot of my peers had struggled with basic ideas of evolution and creation. I wanted to engage with them and enjoyed engaging with them. And Polkinghorne was one of the scientists around who was actually writing in a fashion that made sense. And you know, he wrote incorporating deep theological truths in language that we could understand. I mean, that was the pluses of John. I've got a quote here, which is from his book Science and Creation, which I think is really helpful. The search for understanding will be incomplete if it does not include within itself the religious quest, for otherwise it will leave fundamental questions of significance and purpose unaddressed and unanswered.
Yeah, great. And how was the forum received?
I was a bit stunned, actually, because this was the first year of the forums. We only held 4, and the whole of St Jude's downstairs was filled. So then we had to move people upstairs into the choir loft. Let's not go there. There was vigorous debate. Not everyone agreed with John, but we were allowed to have those conversations. And he was straightforward in his language. He enjoyed the hard questions. You could actually see him like, oh, now we're getting to it. And I think that's what made it good, because the conversation kept going. I mean, he was really concerned that people integrated their faith with a sound understanding of how the world worked. That was it. And he didn't want people to live with inconsistencies in either of those. So keep asking the questions. Come on, bring it to me. It was almost, but he did that in this fine English gentlemanly manner.
Yeah, yeah. So what about the outcomes, if you like, the legacy of Polkinghorne in that context? What did he leave?
Look, I think, one of the things, it was the first year of the open forums, and we continued on for another 5 years or so, which was quite significant. I think he set the tone for future speakers so that he actually provided encouragement for other people to think, okay, how do I grapple with what I'm doing and my faith? You see, Polkinghorne spoke openly. He was grappling with a God whose mind was far more creative, far more thorough and detailed and comprehensive than he could ever imagine. So I think he found God was challenging him, and he actually enjoyed that. And he encouraged us to enjoy it, to not be afraid of it. One of the things I think, it was interesting, 2 years later, we had someone in the congregation who was a technology expert and sociologist. And we suggested to him, why don't you run an open forum? Would God use email? Which is, you're thinking this is 2000. Email was, it wasn't, technology wasn't prolific. But you see, you have to look back at Polkinghorne, because he would encourage us to ask those questions and think, okay, how does God interact with us in those areas? So I think what he did was he helped set the stage in a very humble way for us to be prepared to say, okay, this is where we find ourselves now in. Where's God in this, and how would God interact with it?
Great. Well, before we close, do you have any other comments? Or I'm very grateful. We're very grateful that you could make this appearance, even though I think you're going away, aren't you? So this is a recorded version. You couldn't be with us live on April the 10th. Okay, so where are you now? Assuming now is April the 10th, where are you now?
I will be in Orange.
Excellent.
New South Wales, out in the bush, running around, having a break from school.
Well, thank you for being with us at the same time.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Thanks, Chris.
There we go. Thank you, Philippa, even though she's not here to hear our thanks. Now we have our final speaker, who also is live with us tonight. Nicola, I'm looking for you somewhere. There you are. Nicola's coming to us from a distance, from across the Tasman. I will introduce Nicola again. I mentioned who she was at the beginning, but let me say again, Nicola is the co-chair, co-director of New Zealand Christians in Science. She's also a theologian, and she's going to finish our meeting tonight with a few comments about John Polkinghorne. But before that, Nicola, would you like to say anything else about yourself to introduce us to you before you go on to talk about John Polkinghorne?
Not really. No, that's all good. Yeah.
Great. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so are you going to ask me questions, or am I just going to
I am going to ask you questions, yes.
Okay.
So why don't we start about where did you encounter John?
Okay, so unlike other people, I haven't known him personally, but I did encounter him as a lecturer and author at many of the Templeton-funded science and theology conferences in the late 90s in places like Oxford. And he was also one of the speakers at a God and the Laws of Nature seminar in Venice in 2007. And there he was a very wise, gentle presence, and it was amazing to be in the heart of Venice, listening to him and then feasting on Italian food in the evening. And I appreciate him, as many of the others have said, because he really is a physicist who has indwelt these two different systems of thought, theology and physics, to a very high level. And he has felt confident that these can be brought into dialogue with each other, and even that they can enhance and elucidate each other. A few years ago, I had coffee with a physicist in a New Zealand university I was hoping to draw a few lectures out of him, but I knew he was a Christian, but he told me that he was completely uninterested in any dialogue between faith and science. He did also add that he had recently read some process theology and it was nonsense. So that sort of gave a lie somewhat to the idea that there was nothing fruitful to be done. But I reflected recently on how much poorer we would all be if all physicists thought like that. If Polkinghorne had not written, or if he had not in fact become a priest and a theologian, and if the whole of the science and faith space had only been mostly about biology and philosophy. Yeah.
So do you think his contribution was unique in any way?
Well, not completely, of course, but I think many physicists use their discipline to say how immense the cosmos is and how wonderful it is, which is certainly true. Or they borrow metaphors, which is also very powerful. And Polkinghorne does both of those, but and he did that with entanglement. But he went beyond this, and he picks at theological doctrines from the experimental ground up, as many other people have said. And he interrogated, for example, the theology of divine action and the Trinity. And in this, I think he went where nobody else can really go, or at least perhaps a few physicists can. Because there's a sense, I think, in which physicists understand the universe in a way that is inaccessible at one level to the rest of us, however many videos of Brian Greene we have seen. So for this person with theological and physics sensitivities to talk about divine action, I think is very powerful and very helpful for theology as well.
So where do you think he falls on the spectrum of Christian theology?
Well, I think that's interesting. And I think that I like the fact that Polkinghorne attempts to marry his science with classical Christianity, which is not to say that he was conservative. But I think that he interacted with process theology and panentheism, but he never landed there. And I mean, he was interested, obviously, in process and in the way in which God incorporates time. But on the other side, he pushed hard at some of the static images in classical theology as well. And I think, as everybody knows, so much dialogue in the late 20th century did tend towards process theology and a God who lured rather than acted. And but he was never satisfied, I think, to land there just completely within a process understanding of the world. He wanted, as many people have said, to acknowledge that we experience free choice, and also that our testimony is of God actually acting in the world. But apart from that, though, Christian theology has in recent years especially been very keen to sort of make it an axiom of theology, that there's a non-competition between God's actions and between human actions. And I think that's a good axiom in a way, because it reminds us constantly that God is not a point source of causality. But there's always a lingering doubt. Is this really coherent? How does God really act in a non-competitive way? How does prayer work? And Polkinghorne was asking these questions too. And this middle ground was really very interesting, the middle ground between a sort of more static understanding of God and the process understanding. He wasn't satisfied with process, which was highly rational, but not true enough to the biblical record. And he had to interrogate it to make sure that it wasn't incoherent. He respected mystery, but he wanted to go further than just stating an axiom.
Okay. Yeah. I'll confess that I haven't read Polkinghorne. At least I read one book many years ago, but I'm trying to get a grasp on what you're saying about Polkinghorne and divine action. How does he see God acting?
Well, I don't think he's got a model of it, but just to pick out a few things about that, I think he talks about the causal joint and the need to actually interrogate that and to look at it. He thinks that if we don't, we're going to depersonalize God, and also that we can never be sure if we don't interrogate this causal joint that God isn't producing evil. And he's very concerned that we not just sort of play the paradox card too easily. And I agree with that. I think that theology is often really trying to work out what is paradox and what really is contradiction. And so he was made great contributions there, I think. He distinguishes between information and energetic causality, and I think that's a useful sort of distinction to make. He was also very insistent upon continuous creation, and he rejected any idea that the Platonic idea of static perfection was in any way true. And he was bringing his understanding of physics to bear on this, and his understanding that the evolving creation and the dynamic creation was much more perfect than any understanding of a static creation. And so I appreciate that too. He also thought that God must be active and dynamically present in both creation's contingency and in its necessity or laws. And I like that as well, because I think too often contingency and necessity are sort of rolled out as some sort of magical answer to freedom and causality. And many people have talked about, incarnation, which was important for him because of kenosis. And this is how he saw God's power and love existing together. And I think that's quite widespread in theology as well. But he had an understanding also that that he might be able to extend this understanding of kenosis to causality, and that perhaps God might condescend to act as one cause among others, not just in the incarnation, but in the creation as a whole. And I think there's a lot that could be explored in this idea as well. Yes, so I think that's enough for the moment. Yeah.
You've mentioned Polkinghorne as a physicist a number of times. I'm going to ask you a question, but first I'm going to put you on notice. We have a number of physicists present.
Yeah.
So when you finish, we'll see if any of the physicists present would like to comment. But my question is, do you think that Polkinghorne can say things as a physicist that the rest of us can't?
Well, I think physicists can, perhaps, as I perhaps hinted before, can say things that the rest of us can't. But I think that Polkinghorne was a particular kind of physicist. Others of us and physicists can, indulge in some physics and then say how utterly mind-blowing the world is. And I think this is what Consul Magno, the Vatican astronomer, I think that was one of his main messages. Or we can borrow metaphors, and Polkinghorne does that with entanglement, for instance. But Polkinghorne really sort of digs in further and really interrogates, Christian theology, as people have said, from the bottom up. And I think in that sense, he's doing something that perhaps the rest of us can't do so easily. And I think somebody else said they didn't like his understanding of chaos, but I do like his understanding of what he calls the extensive intrinsic unpredictabilities, both in the microscopic realm of quantum mechanics and also in the macroscopic realm of chaotic dynamics. And I think he sees, opportunities there for openness, and that there is a loci for alternative causal principles. And I think that's possibly very fruitful as well. And I think that in that sense, yes, he's doing something and contributing something to theology that can't be contributed otherwise.
Thanks, Nicola. Do you have any last comments you'd like to make before we see if others, including those physicists...
I put my foot in it, you mean, yes. Well, I think when I remember him in Venice, I'm reminded of the verse in Job, which says that with long life comes understanding. He had an expansive vision of the world, bringing together many disciplines. And he wondered and reflected on how extraordinary it was that we can imagine any of these things at all. And so I'd like to end with a quote where he says, "There is no a priori reason why beautiful equations should prove to be the clue to understanding nature, why fundamental physics should be possible, why our minds should have such ready access to the deep structure of the universe. It is a contingent fact that this is true of us and of our world, but it does not seem sufficiently simple to regard it as a happy accident." I think I'll end there.
Thank you, Philippa. Thank you.
I'm Nicola. I'm Nicola.
Nicola. I know you're Nicola. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you very much. Now, before we go into general discussion, I really would like to invite any of the physicists present amongst us to make a comment. Would any physicists care to comment on what we've heard about John Polkinghorne, but also what Nicholas said? Ken Freeman, I know you're there somewhere. I'm just looking to see if you're still with us. Ken Freeman is a mathematical physicist and won the Prime Minister's Prize for Science. But I think, there he is. Ken, welcome, Ken. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society. Ken, do you have any comment?
Yeah, look, just one comment. And I really enjoyed Nicola's talk. Thank you very much for that. And I worked on chaos theory a bit in the very early days of chaos theory. And my perception of chaos theory is that, people say, okay, chaos theory is very chaotic, not predictive, but it's very predictive. If you repeat the same computation twice, you will get the same rather chaotic looking answer. But the point about it is that you change your initial conditions just a tiny bit and you get a completely different product. So it isn't quite so unpredictable as perhaps people might think.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you. And while you're there, Ken, do you have any other comments you'd like to make on Polkinghorne or?
Yeah, well, I overlapped with Polkinghorne when I was a student, but it really was just an overlap. I really didn't interact with him at all. I mean, the main interaction we had was when I went back to Cambridge as a postdoc, and we had no electricity in the middle of winter for 2 weeks, and his dear wife met my dear wife somewhere along the line and suggested we might like to come and bath our baby in their bath, and that's what we did. But that's about the limit of it. Unfortunately, we really didn't interact much. But I have read some of his books, and I really enjoy his particular view on reality. I find that very, very much agrees with my own view of things. So.
Thank you, Ken. And perhaps that's another reflection on the gentle Christian spirit of the Polkinghorns. Thank you. John Pilbrow, I see that you're unmuted. That could be by accident, or it could be because you're a physicist and you have something to say.
Well, I was just want to thank Nicola for her reflection on aspects of John's thought I hadn't particularly dealt with. And my background in physics was not in particle physics and a high level use of mathematics, though I did use mathematics all the time. I think John had a profound sense that not just that the equations, were beautiful and addressed issues of understanding at a level that without them we couldn't have achieved. I think his bottom-up approach to thinking was interesting because he didn't start like a philosopher with a top-down view, with a sort of a global theory about knowledge or the world. And I've often pondered the extent to which perhaps he might have benefited by being sometimes more of a top-down thinker than he was. I heard him say many times, and in conversation as well, that this was the way he felt he could contribute by thinking along the lines he had as a theoretical physicist from the bottom up. I remember having a conversation about 20 years ago with Paul Davies over lunch, and we discussed this, and we discussed John Polkinghorne, whom he knew well, And we agreed that, physics was really summed up in, I don't know, a dozen or 15 key equations, depends how you define them. And that's pretty remarkable. And John often quoted John von Neumann, or was it Wigner, who often expressed the view that, it just seemed incomprehensible that mathematics could create such a level of understanding in our world. Now, I don't think you can translate that into theology exactly, but John used habits of mind for his own theological work. And I think, as we've heard tonight, not all theologians necessarily would go along with that. But I guess I'd like to just sum up in one sentence. John spoke in a language that many of us understood, and that was incredibly helpful and fruitful.
Thank you, John. Now we have some time. If
I feel like you've put me on the spot as well, so
okay, let's hear
I've
from
fallen for taking the bait yet again.
For those who arrived a little bit late, Roger Lewis is also a physicist and is also chair of ISCAST. Thanks, Roger.
It's interesting what John was just saying about there being 15 equations or so that sum up physics, and physicists, have these very grand views. They have the grand unified theories, and even these theories of everything. So this idea that everything can be encapsulated in even just put those equations, rewrite those equations, say zeros on the right-hand side, add all those equations together, and there you have one master equation for the whole universe. So there's this great, you might say, arrogance among physicists, and I think this is displayed in some atheist physicists who use their physics as a tool to perhaps try to deny God. But Polkincorn just seems the exact opposite of that in his humble approach. I remember hearing him once after the talk answering questions of some I think Christian theological students asking what were almost disrespectful questions for someone of his standing, but he just treated them very carefully and gently and explained. So I think yes, he certainly brings a mathematical view and a physical view and understanding. But I was going to say also this mathematical point that's been raised a couple of times, the so-called unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in Wigner's words in explaining the physical world. So that's a great combination. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Roger. Now, does anybody else have a comment or a question to somebody who's spoken? You're welcome to speak up. Don't be shy, just because we're in this rather different sort of environment. Well then,
Chris, can I
go ahead, John.
pipe up again? I think one of the things that some of us did talk to John about when we had the privilege of being with him was how can some of this be brought out into the level of the local congregation, the local parish. And I think, as I think Alastair explained, John probably gained insight into the sorts of approaches one might take through his curacy and his time at Blean near Canterbury. But I think the reality is that his work and most of the writing in this area is really addressing the educated Christian, but not particularly the person in the pews. And I think there's a great need there. And I've struggled with this for 6 decades. And how do you do this? How do you get people on side even to sit and address it? Faraday Institute's test of faith was something some of us ran in our parishes. But, that was a one-off event for 3 months or so. It's not something that we've been able to sustain in our particular situations. And it just seems to me that the changed understanding of the world through modern science is something which Christians simply cannot ignore, or they ignore at their peril. But I don't think we've found the right way to get down to the grassroots with these things. And it's not a matter of dumbing things down. That would be unhelpful, I think. But somehow, even to have Christians in the pews respecting their friends who may be in the scientific world or the research world, but to some of the views I hear from time to time just make my hair curl. And we need something which I don't think quite exists yet, but which I think is desperately needed in the churches.
I think, you know, I mentioned Brian Greene, and he makes these fantastic, you know, videos. It's a pity he's not a Christian, but, you know, something like that. I mean, people who have a lot of experience with making ideas very simple and putting them in video form would probably be, you know, very helpful. And I know when I was teaching theology that the DVD that most students wanted to borrow was the one about the elegant universe, and which shows you that there is some sort of you know, appreciation for, I mean, even just to sort of think about some of these basic issues and how wonderful they are. So it does resonate with people who are thinking about faith.
Yes.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you, John. And although you didn't know it, that's an excellent lead into a quick story that I was going to tell as we finish tonight. What we're doing tonight is perhaps one end of the ISCAST spectrum. It's the highly engaged, academic, hard thinking about science and faith. Let me tell you the other end of the ISCAST spectrum, if you like, and why we're so keen as a board and staff to grow and to do the sorts of things that we're talking about, going into churches and going into schools. The story I was going to tell you was the story of my visit to St Margaret's School in Brisbane about 3 weeks ago, where I spoke to all of the Year 10 girls, and I spoke to them in two groups. In the first group, instead of speaking about the wonders of the amazing world that we live in, I invited Sarah Sweet, an astrophysicist from the University of Queensland, to join me. She's a Christian woman. She joined me with her 7-week-old child, and she spoke about the wonders of the universe that we live in. She spoke about what it was like to be a woman and a Christian in science. She fed her baby halfway through the session, and that was probably the highlight for the girls, to see the integration of a woman, her baby, her astrophysics, a woman in science from the university. So there, if you like, is the other end of what we do in ISCAST, and it's the other end, and it's an opportunity that we have right across the country. If we had people who we were confident about sending into schools, if we had enough of them, we could, if we advertised, we could be seeing hundreds of thousands, and I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of thousands of students every year, because chaplains and RE teachers are I don't know about desperate, but they're more than willing. If they have the right speakers who can come into their schools and talk to their students about science and faith in a way that is not boring on the one hand, and on the other hand is not it doesn't step across the lines that you simply can't step across when you're speaking in an educational institution, we could be receiving those invitations. But right at the moment, our resources in terms of background staffing and administrating that sort of program are not there yet, and we need to grow the number of people that can speak across the country. So that's really an advertisement for what ISCAST is doing. It's an advertisement to say, will you please pray about these things? And it's also an advertisement for saying, please consider giving to the cause, because as many of you know, we're going to put on 2 staff in the next month, 2 part-time staff. One person will be a research and publications director. They will deal with the more academic end of what ISCAST does. And another person will be a digital communication specialist. They will deal with they will probably be a digital native themselves, probably someone 25, 30 years old. They will deal with social media, and they will be creative in ways of engaging younger people in the conversation about science and faith. So anyway, enough advertisements for ISCAST. I'd be happy to talk to you about what ISCAST is doing. I'd be happy to hear from you, Heather. I see that hand.
Oh, well, I was just thinking, like you've been saying, I'm not a physicist, I'm a semi-retired maths teacher. And my claim to fame with the Polkinghornes is that his son was in my youth group in Cambridge for a while. But the teacher bit and the person in the pew that does not have the knowledge or the vocabulary to even read a chapter in a book, but needs it breaking down and analysing for them. I think the least we can do is create a sense of wonder and a sense of mystery, a bit like David Attenborough does in the natural world, so that people are at least led to a bigger, that there might be something bigger out there. And the really dangerous thing is when people in the church give very glib, simplistic answers, which puts even the average intelligent person off, let alone the more intelligent, because they can't, you know, they can see that this can't match up. You cannot have a black and white God who says this and did that or thinks this if it doesn't make sense in the real world. So I think to get rid of our arrogant, simplistic, oh, we have the answers in a church situation or a school situation would be a great move forward. And I think what you just said about the engaging in the schools will be fantastic. And that you can create a space where it's okay to ask questions. There might not be simple answers, but just start the questions.
Yes.
You know, it's not like everything's got a pat answer. And at the ages of 15, 16, 17, you're just opening them up to see how big the subject is. It's not just, you know, this is the answer to the HSC question. It's opening them up to see how big the subject is, and there aren't answers for everything.
Yes. Thanks, Heather. Yes, that's right. And when we go to schools, we always ensure there's plenty of space for questions afterwards, and we don't pretend that we have all the answers. Now, why don't we wind up the formal meeting now? I'm going to ask Roger if he would pray for us to wind up the meeting. And then if you'd like to stay behind and talk a bit more about the things that we're doing in schools or in churches or whatever, you're welcome to stay behind and we can have an informal chat. But right now, Roger, over to you. Would you mind praying for us to close our meeting?
Chris, if I've enjoyed this meeting and would like to go to something similar in the coming weeks, do you have anything to suggest?
Well, Roger, it's funny you should say that. Thank you for that Dorothy Dix question. We have a series of meetings. We're calling them the ISCAST Conversations. We had 12 last year, and we had some almost 300 people were registered for them. This year, we're doing them in collaboration with New Zealand Christians in Science. We have 11 meetings coming up. You can find them on the ISCAST website. They start on April the 22nd. This year, we will be charging a small price for the whole series of conversations. And it would be great if you join us. It would also be great if you'd point other people to the conversations. We've got some fascinating conversations coming up. The way we normally run them is somebody speaks about the topic for maybe 20 minutes or half an hour, and then we go into a conversation. So have a look at the ISCAST website, and I do hope some of you will join us. Thank you, Roger.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks everyone who's been here, all the participation. It's been great. I thought to close in prayer, I'd actually read a couple of passages that have come up in the discussion, one from Philippians 2 and then one from 1 Thessalonians 5. So let's pray together in these words of scripture. So from Philippians 2, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.
Amen.
And from 1 Thessalonians, rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Do not quench the spirit, do not despise prophecies, but test everything, hold fast what is good, abstain from every form of evil. Now may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely, and may your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. He who calls you is faithful, he will surely do it. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with us all. Amen.